Hey everyone, welcome to this end of the year special. I've put together a supercut of Undesigned Coincidences, those subtle connections between Paul's letters, Acts, and even secular history that scream reliability. Now, you'll notice that my style has evolved quite a bit since these earlier videos, so I'm sorry for the lack of crazy memes, but the information here is still spot on. Now, it might feel a little jumpy at parts since these were originally separate clips, but together they build a powerful case for Acts. So let's dive in. What are undesigned coincidences? If you've dabbled in Christian apologetics, chances are you've come across this phrase. But what's the real deal when people toss it around? What's the meaning behind it? Sometimes two historical records incidentally touch on the same point in a manner that would be very unlikely if one of them copied from the other, or if both were copied from a common source. For example, one account of an event may leave out a bit of information, leaving some natural question unanswered, while a different account indirectly supplies the missing detail and, in so doing, answers that question. When this happens, the best explanation is that both records are grounded in the actual historical event. That's why the two bits fit together so well. Forgers do not want to leave loose ends like this that might raise awkward questions. They take care to tie everything together neatly, but these are the sorts of things that we would expect to find in authentic records of the same real event told by different people who knew what they were talking about. I often find that starting with a modern hypothetical example is most effective. Let's say the police receive a phone call about a bank robbery and rush to the scene. They begin questioning witnesses who claim to have seen the incident. One mentions that the bank robber was wearing untied tennis shoes, while the other describes the robber tripping and almost falling as they fled. Interestingly, the person talking about the trip doesn't mention the untied shoelace and vice versa. This is an example of an undesigned coincidence. The untied shoelace could easily explain the tripping, providing the answer to the question, why did the robber trip? It's like fitting puzzle pieces together, where each witness seems to contribute to the larger picture of what happened. Because reality seamlessly aligns, so do their statements. Let's take it out of the realm of the hypothetical and look at some more modern historical examples from the Anne Frank narratives. Ronnie Goldstein Van Cleef recalls Auschwitz arrivals being divided with shouts of this side, that side. Hannah Elizabeth Pitt Goslar recounts Mengele's Reichslinks. Why the division? Leni de Jan van Naarden explains, the very old and the young were separated and sent to the crematorium. Here's another example. Rachel van Amerongen Frankfurter remembers Anne and Margot going to the fence, thinking that Anne knew somebody on the free side. Why all the fence visits? Did they know somebody? We find out from Hannah Elizabeth Pitt Goslar that she spoke to Anne while she was in Bergen-Belsen, and she occasionally tossed her Red Cross packages. Numerous undesigned coincidences create a web across the Gospels. John clarifies the synoptics, the synoptic Gospels shed light on John, and the synoptics even explain each other. Beyond that, we find many more connections between the letters of the Apostle Paul and the book of Acts. Let's kick things off with an example from William Paley's Horae Paulinae, the pioneering work that dives deep into this argument. Paley's goal is to show the dozens of correspondences between the book of Acts and Paul's letters. The cluster of coincidences begins with a couple of quotes from 1 Corinthians. What I mean is that each of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Both of these verses suggest that Apollos was in Corinth, and the second one hints that Paul had been there before him. Now, when we turn to the book of Acts, we get a clear picture of Paul's travels and some details about Apollos that confirm these hints. After Paul's initial visit to Greece, he went from Corinth to Ephesus, leaving his friends Priscilla and Aquila behind. He then journeyed back to Palestine, making stops in Jerusalem and heading north into Asia Minor. Eventually, he returned to Ephesus. It's during these latter travels that Apollos burst onto the scene. Apollos was taught in Ephesus by Priscilla and Aquila, and then traveled to Achaia, where he played a significant role in helping those who had believed through grace. What's interesting is that Apollos went to Corinth on this trip, and we don't need to guess, as we find that Paul returned to Ephesus at the exact time Apollos was in Corinth. There's another interesting connection, though a bit indirect, between this passage in Acts and something Paul mentions when addressing the Corinthians in his second letter. Do we need, he asks with evident exasperation, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? This question is rhetorical. You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts, and known and read by all. As it happens, the book of Acts provides the clue to Paul's language. For when Apollos, having been instructed by Priscilla and Aquila, made his own trip to Corinth, the, quote, brothers encouraged him and wrote to all the disciples to welcome him. But there's more. Throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul repeatedly brings up his lack of eloquence, almost turning it into a theological virtue. One of these times is when he's concerned about their divisions. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. It's not hard to figure out that during the arguments in the Corinthian church, those against Paul were probably pointing out that he wasn't very impressive compared to their favorite speaker, Apollos. Paul's comments align with what Acts says about Apollos being an eloquent man, and this quality was valued especially in Corinth. In Romans 11 and Philippians 3, Paul mentions that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Back in the early chapters of Acts, we find out that he was originally called Saul before his conversion. It's only after his encounter with Sergius Paulus in chapter 13 that he decides to go by Paul. And then 1 Samuel 9, 1-2 notes that the first king of Israel was also named Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, it's not exactly a slam dunk, but what if Paul, the Saul turned Paul guy, was named after that famous first king of Israel? Saul was pretty significant in their tribe's history. Some here might raise an eyebrow, saying that naming a kid after him might be a bit iffy considering his not-so-great history with God and all the drama with King David. But Paul, being previously named Saul and being from the tribe of Benjamin, suggests that our perception of Saul as an unequivocal bad guy might not be entirely on the mark. Consider that after Saul's passing in 2 Samuel 1:23, King David spoke very highly of him, praising Saul as a formidable warrior, likening him to an eagle and a lion. It's plausible that later descendants of Benjamin took pride in their heritage by naming their kid Saul. It's pretty much common knowledge among those who acquainted with the New Testament that Paul was formerly known as Saul. It's a detail that's widely known, and it's almost just taken for granted. Yet here's the kicker. Acts, our main source for this information, Luke, he never brings up Saul, Paul's tribe. And curiously, in all of Paul's letters, there's no mention of his former name being Saul. It's a seamless fit of a number of different puzzle pieces from separate sources. Also, the absence of any reference to Paul's tribe in Acts, despite it being an easy inclusion, makes it very unlikely that the author of Acts made up Paul's earlier name based on brief mentions in his letters. This is a classic example of an undesigned coincidence, and it's a marker that Acts is rooted in eyewitness testimony. When it comes to money, Paul was a touchy guy. In both his letters to the Thessalonians and the Corinthians, Paul makes it clear that he worked to support himself. It's a big deal to him, going so far to say that he'd rather die than claim a living from preaching the gospel. He isn't saying that it's wrong for preachers to support themselves and their families from their ministries, but he chooses not to exercise this right. However, in 2 Corinthians 11, 7-9, Paul does defensively acknowledge receiving an offering from the church in Macedonia, but he emphasizes that he worked to support himself and never took any offering from the Corinthians, despite spending 1.5 years with them. He writes, "Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way." In Philippians 4:15-16, we learn that Paul did receive an offering from the Philippians while he was in Thessalonica. Both Philippi and Thessalonica are in Macedonia, while Corinth is in Greece. As Acts 16-18 records Paul's journey from Philippi to Thessalonica and eventually to Corinth, we infer that he received money from Macedonia after leaving the province a couple of times. Interestingly enough, Acts 18:1-5 tells us about Paul arriving in Corinth, working with Priscilla and Aquila. Initially, he spent Sabbaths in the synagogue, arguing with Jews and Greeks. However, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul shifted his focus to full-time ministry. The reason for this sudden change is not at all specified by Luke in Acts, and he may not have known, but this aligns perfectly with what we read in 2 Corinthians. Money came to Paul from Macedonia, delivered by Christian brothers. While Acts doesn't explicitly mention that the money came from Macedonia, the hypothesis that it did explains Acts and harmonizes with the details found in Paul's letters. But there's actually more about Paul's touchiness with money that we can discuss here. In 1 Corinthians 4:11-12, Paul mentions that he continued working with his own hands, quote, even until the present hour, meaning up to the time that he wrote his letter in Ephesus. Now, let's talk about what Acts says about Paul's time in Ephesus in chapter 19. Surprisingly, there's no mention of him doing manual labor there. However, in Acts 20, we find that when he returned from Greece, Paul called the elders of the Ephesian church to meet him in Miletus. In his address to them, he emphasized, "I have not desired anyone's wealth, possessions, or clothing. You yourselves know that I worked with my hands to provide for my own needs and the needs of those with me." It's important to note that he's addressing the Ephesian church elders directly and discussing his recent conduct in Ephesus. This shows that the manual labor Paul did in Corinth continued over to Ephesus. He maintained this practice during his specific stay in Ephesus, close to the time when he wrote the letter. Therefore, when he wrote, "Even until this very hour we labor, working with our own hands," it was a genuine statement. The consistency across these passages strongly supports the idea that Acts wasn't borrowing from the letter. If it had, the detail about Paul's activities in Ephesus would have been mentioned. The indirect reference in the letter, where a later statement refers to something not found in Acts, adds to its authenticity. This evidence strongly suggests that the author of Acts knew Paul very well. 1 Thessalonians 2:2, Paul opens up about being shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know. But what exactly is the backstory in Philippi? Just reading Paul's letter leaves us in the dark. Now let's flip over to Acts 16 for the missing pieces. You know the story, Paul and Silas facing unjust beatings and a stint in Philippi's slammer. It's a Sunday school classic. Hymns at midnight, miraculous release, converting the Philippian jailer, and a sunrise apology from city elders. Fast forward to Acts 17 and we find Paul making tracks to Thessalonica on the same missionary journey post-Philippi escapade. It's a perfect match for his quick reference in 1 Thessalonians 2:2. Picture Paul still fuming, venting to the Thessalonian converts about how badly they had been mistreated in Philippi. That's why he confidently drops the line, "I was treated shamefully in Philippi, as you know." But again, if we're just reading Paul's letters, we wouldn't have a clue what happened there. But there's more happening in 1 Thessalonians. Chapter 2, verses 14 through 15 reads, "For you, brothers, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and displeased God and opposed all mankind." Whoa, Paul is seriously heated here. This is a far cry from the guy who prayed for the salvation of all the Jews in Romans 10. Skeptics like Richard Carrier even suggest that this verse might be a later addition to the text. Just reading 1 Thessalonians leaves us wondering about the backstory behind Paul's anger. But flip over to Acts 17 and the plot thickens. Jews in Thessalonica, aiming to rile up the Gentile crowds, spread rumors that Paul was inciting rebellion against Caesar. The mob, driven by this false narrative, dragged Thessalonian Christians before the authorities demanding bond. Paul, sensing trouble, made a hasty exit from the city. Politics of the time were at play. Outside Jewish territories in the Roman Empire, direct persecution by Jewish agitators was rather tricky, so they resorted to stirring up Gentile mobs instead. Acts 17 reveals that it wasn't a one-time show. They actually paid their way down and pulled the very same stunt in Berea. So in Thessalonica, the Christians faced trouble from their own countrymen, as Paul's letter points out, rather than directly from the Jews. But Paul had good reason to be annoyed with his Jewish pursuers, hounding him from town to town because he dared to preach to the Gentiles. This wasn't a one-off, it was a recurring theme in Acts. Fed up with the harassment, Paul threw off his gloves, explaining the harsh words in 1 Thessalonians. There's no need to think that this was added to the text.
In 1 Corinthians 4:17, Paul mentioned sending Timothy, his beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to jog the Corinthians' memory about Paul's ways in Christ. Now, from this passage alone, it's a bit tricky to figure out if Timothy was sent before the letter or with it. In 1 Corinthians 16:10 through 11, though, Paul makes it clear that Timothy was dispatched before the letter was penned. He talks about Timothy's impending arrival as something distinct from when the Corinthians would receive the letter itself, for it reads, "For when Timothy comes." Now, when you stack these two passages side by side, a puzzling question pops up. If Timothy was sent first, why didn't he show up first? And if he did arrive first, why bother sending instructions afterward to welcome him? The most sensible answer is that Timothy, even though he was sent ahead, must have taken a roundabout route to Corinth. The quickest way from Ephesus, where Paul was writing, to Corinth would be by ship, covering the distance in a jiffy with a favorable wind. But as we dig into Acts 19:21 through 22, we do in fact discover that Timothy, when leaving Ephesus, opted for the overland route, traveling up through Macedonia. Once again, we stumble upon these cool coincidences that weren't orchestrated, but fit together seamlessly. Paul's letter doesn't mention a word about Timothy's trek through Macedonia, and Acts doesn't bring up Paul's letter. Yet, Acts offers the only sensible explanation for these offhand remarks Paul makes in his letter, creating this neat puzzle where the pieces just click into place. But there's more about Timothy. When Paul writes the church at Philippi, he says, "I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by the news of you. For I have no one like him, who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interest, and not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he served me in the gospel." In this passage, it's pretty clear that the Philippians knew Timothy and had seen him working alongside Paul. The neat part is how there's this subtle and smooth connection between what's written in Philippians and the story in the book of Acts. So in Acts 16, Paul starts traveling with Timothy, a convert from around Lystra and Iconium. After that, the Acts story gets into Paul's travels across Asia Minor to Troas and then to Macedonia. When they hit Philippi, the story dives into Paul's missionary adventures, detailing his struggles and hardships that we discussed in the previous video. Acts 17 continues the journey, covering Paul's move from Philippi to Thessalonica, where things get pretty heated and he has to leave. Then comes this really sneaky part. The brothers secretly send Paul and Silas to Berea at night, and when they get there, they hit up the local Jewish synagogue. That's when Timothy pops back into the picture. Acts 17:14 says, "Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there." So even though Timothy wasn't explicitly mentioned during the journey, Acts 17:10-15 shows that he was indeed still rolling with Paul at Berea. Silas gets more of the spotlight in the story, but Acts hints that Paul had more buddies along, including the author himself. This revelation about Timothy being there in Berea fills in the gaps and explains how the Philippians knew about Timothy's skills and saw him working hard with Paul, like a son with his father. What's interesting is that Acts doesn't straight up say that Timothy was in Philippi. You have to connect the dots by piecing together Timothy's role from different mentions in the book of Acts. It's not like the author of Acts was trying to be all sneaky and create a link with the book of Philippians. Instead, this connection adds weight to the idea that the author of Acts really knew Paul's life inside and out, including his friends and moves during that time. But wait, there's another nifty example of an undesigned coincidence in the same passage. So in Thessalonica, Paul's ministry gets interrupted by a rowdy bunch of Jews, prompting a quick escape with Silas to Berea, as we mentioned. When the troublemakers catch wind that Paul is still preaching in Berea, they show up, causing a ruckus. Paul has to skedaddle to Athens in a hurry, leaving Silas and Timothy behind. Now, Acts doesn't spill the beans on why Paul left Silas and Timothy hanging. In 1 Thessalonians 3:1-2, it gives us the missing piece. It reads, "Therefore, when we can bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith." Turns out, under the circumstances, Paul sent Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on the folks there and report back while Paul was busy in Athens. This neatly clears up the unexplained bit in Acts, making sense of the separation from Silas and Timothy. Expository preachers often breeze past certain sections of Paul's letters, especially the endless list of greetings like greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Petrobus, Hermas. It's a surefire way to put the congregation to sleep. But if we're paying attention, these passages sometimes can hit us with some really cool examples of undesigned coincidences. Now, as a quick refresher, an undesigned coincidence happens when one account of an event leaves out certain information and another recording of the same event, often unintentionally, provides us with the missing details. This helps address questions that arise from the first account. See my first video in this series if you need more of an explanation. Now, consider this passing reference in Romans 16:3-4. "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well." That's a really nice compliment, Paul, but what exactly is the story here? If we only had Paul's letter to the Romans, these references would just be left hanging. So, for starters, the fact that this greeting is in the letter to the Romans implies that Prisca and Aquila had lived in Rome. Now, let's flip to Acts 18:2. It talks about Aquila and Priscilla, who were in Rome, but they had to leave due to an order from the Emperor Claudius. This aligns with the Roman historian Suetonius' account, who tells us that Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome, which confirms Luke's accuracy. It looks like they might have returned to Rome after the expulsion had settled down. That's interesting, but there's a lot more to the tale. Now look at this. Paul calls them fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Well, in Acts 18, we see that Paul made tents with them, and when he left, they went along with him. So it's fair to say that they worked together, even though Paul explicitly mentions it only in his greeting to the Romans. But Acts gives us more details. Now, for a third point, Paul mentions that Aquila and Prisca risked their necks for him. Well, how so? Check out Acts 18:12-17. There we read that Paul gets into trouble with the Roman authorities, and a Corinthian named Sosthenes faces a beating from the crowd. If Aquila and Priscilla were working with Paul in Corinth, it's evident that they were also in risky situations and faced similar dangers. Now, let's talk about the fourth and final point. Paul mentions that the Gentile churches are grateful for Aquila and Prisca. This stands out, especially considering the letter's overall themes. Going back to Acts 18:2, again we learn that Aquila, though a Jew, was expelled from Rome during the time of trouble in the Jewish quarter related to someone called Chrestus, which is often a common Roman mix-up with Christus. Despite being Jews themselves, Aquila and Prisca worked with Paul, who right there in Corinth shifted his focus from the Jews to the Gentiles. From then on, he successfully spread the gospel among the Gentiles. So Prisca and Aquila, though Jews, played a role in ministering to the Gentiles, earning them the heartfelt thanks of these Gentile churches. Now, let's take a look at just one other example from the same list of greetings, this time in Romans 16:1-3. There, Paul speaks highly of Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchreae, asking others to welcome her in a manner befitting the saints. He also notes that she's been a generous supporter, not just to many, but also to Paul himself. Now, why does Paul praise a deacon from Cenchreae? Well, since Paul is likely writing from Corinth, Cenchreae may be close by. But we don't need a map to confirm this, though it does, as Acts tells us that Paul visited Cenchreae after leaving Corinth. So these seemingly mundane lists of greetings actually provide us with several points of indirect connection, consistency, and harmony with the events in Acts, even without directly using the exact same words.
With a life full of travel and relationships like Paul's, there are many chances for undesigned coincidences to pop up. So many that it's worth taking a moment to consider some evidence that Acts was not written by somebody who had Paul's letters in front of them. For example, check out the account Paul gives of his escape from Damascus in 2 Corinthians 11 and compare it with the version in Acts chapter 9. The main facts are the same, but the differences make it clear that the history wasn't written based on the letter. In 2 Corinthians, Paul mentions that Aretas had the city guarded, but there's no info on who did the guarding. In Acts, we're told that the Jews kept watch at the gates for Paul, likely needing the approval of the ethnarch, yet Aretas is not named. Sure, you can try and reconcile these statements. He who does a thing by another does it himself, as the saying goes, but it's not believable that the Acts writer crafted the history based on the letter. Or compare the story of Paul's conversion in Acts with Paul's own version in Galatians. In Acts we read, "Now he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.'" Comparing this with Galatians 1:15-17, "When it pleased God to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. I did not go to Jerusalem to those who are apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned to Damascus." Now, this might seem like a small thing, but think about it. If the book of Acts was made up or written much later, why would the writer specifically mention Paul's conversion happening on the road to Damascus and then him going to the city afterward? Why Damascus of all places? Damascus isn't even a big deal in the rest of the Acts story. Some might guess that the Acts author got his info from Galatians and used it to spice up their own version, even if they didn't really know Paul or were making up some of the history. But there's a snag in that idea. Galatians, especially this particular part, has been used to argue that the story of Paul's early days in the book of Galatians doesn't match up with what's in Acts 9. Acts 9 skips the trip to Arabia, and it seems like Paul stayed in Damascus until he had to escape over the wall. Also, while Galatians suggests that Paul left Damascus for Jerusalem after 3 years, Acts doesn't seem to show that much time passing. Now, it's not like these differences between Acts and Galatians can't be reconciled. The Acts writer says Paul left Damascus because of a plot against him after many days, which could include 3 years involving a trip to Arabia and a return to Damascus that Acts doesn't mention. But if the author of Acts was using Galatians to try and match things up, they probably wouldn't have put in the Damascus part based on Paul's passing comment, while ignoring the trip to Arabia or the 3-year gap. Why include a subtle connection with Galatians and skip over the more obvious points that need explaining? That would mean the author of Acts was both super sneaky and a world-class screw-up at the same time. The fact that Damascus lines up is a sign that the Acts writer knew about Paul independently from Galatians. Or how about another undesigned coincidence?
Galatians 1:18 says, after 3 years, Paul headed to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him for 15 days. Now, why the short visit? It might raise an eyebrow that after 3 years, Paul's stay in Jerusalem was a brief 15 days. Wouldn't you think you'd want to pick Peter's brain a bit longer than 2 weeks? We could speculate that Paul was in a hurry to start some missionary work, but he doesn't provide the details. But there is no need to guess. Turn to Acts, and we have our answer. In Acts 9:29, we read that Paul argued with the Hellenists, and they were out to kill him. When the brothers caught wind of this plot, they whisked him away to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Well, that explains it. Paul had to make a quick exit because there were people trying to martyr him not long after his conversion. But without looking at Acts, we'd be left wondering why his visit was so brief.
So in Acts 27, we're treated to this gripping account of Paul's turbulent journey and shipwreck. Let's check it out. In verses 3 through 6, we read about how they start off in Sidon, where Julius the centurion shows some unexpected kindness by letting Paul catch up with his buddies for a bit. Then they hit the seas, hugging the coast of Cyprus to shield themselves from the relentless winds. After navigating through Sicilia and Pamphylia, they finally dock in Myra, Lycia. And guess what? Right there they find a ship heading straight for Italy, just what they needed. Now, here's where it gets interesting historically speaking. Colin Hemmer, a classical historian, shed some light on Myra's significance. He points out that it was actually a major port for Alexandrian corn ships, precisely where Julius would expect to snag a ride to Italy. Plus, it had this fancy Hadriatic granary, showcasing its official importance. Myra was basically the official gateway port for ships coming from the east, like Patara was from the opposite direction, and we'll talk about Patara in future videos. Now, you might think, okay, Eric, I'm bored to death, so what? But here's the thing. It's not like Luke had access to Google or Wikipedia to just look up stuff about Myra. It's these kind of details that really amp up the credibility of Acts as a historical document. But you might say, well, come on, it was probably just common knowledge. All right, well, let's just hang tight a little bit and keep unraveling this gripping story in Acts 27. So verses 13 through 14 paint this picture of the crew sailing close to the shores of Crete, thinking they're in for a smooth ride. But boom, out of nowhere, this ferocious northeasterly wind, a real tempest, comes barreling down from the land. Now, here's where things get fascinating. There's historical proof actually again backing up Luke's account. You see, meteorologists tell us that there's this well-documented wind that sweeps over Crete from the northeast, especially around the time of the Day of Atonement in the fall, just like Acts 27:9 mentions. Then here comes the real kicker. Acts 27:16 talks about how this storm blows them off course toward this tiny little island called Cauda. What's mind-blowing is that Cauda sits more than 20 miles west-southwest from where the storm hit them in the Bay of Masara. Now, this isn't something that you could just guess. Back then, pinpointing islands this far out was like finding a needle in a haystack. Colin Hemmer points out that even the ancient bigwigs like Pliny, the encyclopedist, and Ptolemy, that ancient cartographer, couldn't get the location of Cauda right. Pliny had it way too far east, and Ptolemy placed it way too close to the western end of Crete. Luke's got him beat by a mile. Now, hold on to your hat because there's even more to this particular tale. James Smith, a seasoned sailor from the 19th century, really dug deep into Paul's maritime misadventure. He's convinced that the shipwreck described in Acts 27 through 28 happened smack dab on the island of Malta. But he doesn't stop there. Oh no, he goes full-on detective mode. Smith meticulously pores over the text of Acts, comparing it with accounts of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean by folks like Josephus and Lucian. Plus, he throws in a boatload of nautical knowledge about winds, water depths, and coastlines. And you know what? His conclusion is pretty solid. Luke's account isn't just some fisherman's tale, it's got authenticity written all over it. Now, I won't bore you with all the nitty-gritty details that Smith lays out, but let me give you just a small taste. He uncovers a bunch of little clues scattered throughout the text that all point to the same conclusion. So here's the scoop. Luke doesn't provide a ton of detailed information about the journey from Cauda to Malta in Acts. However, by piecing together the clues that he does give, it's possible to roughly estimate the ship's course and speed. It seems that they were sailing northward, trying to stay as close to the wind known as Euraculo as safely possible. This strategy, called tacking, would cover approximately 476 miles over a little more than 13 days, assuming a drift rate of around 1.5 miles an hour. As Acts 27:27 describes, On the 14th night of the voyage, they found themselves very close to the island of Malta. Bingo. Here's where things get really interesting. Luke throws in this fancy Greek nautical term bolisantes, which basically means that they were taking soundings. The numbers he gives match up perfectly with the timeline between spotting the breaking waves near Cora, about 20 fathoms, and realizing they were heading straight for some serious shoreline trouble at about 15 fathoms. And get this, in Acts 28:7, Luke refers to a guy named Publius as the first man of the island. Now, that might sound like some random title, but it was actually the official designation on Malta, backed up by archaeological inscriptions and all. But wait, there's even more to this fascinating puzzle. Smith goes the extra mile in his analysis. Not only was the narrator of this epic voyage and shipwreck an eyewitness, but he was also a landsman. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that Luke wasn't some sea-savvy sailor who's making up this story about his journey. No, he was a regular guy, just observing and reporting with a keen eye. Let me break it down with a few examples. When Luke mentions the Greek terms chalisantes teskeos, he's not just throwing out some fancy nautical words. He's actually describing the crew stripping down any unnecessary rigging. Now, a seasoned sailor might know this was to get the ship on the right track, but Luke, being a landsman, might have missed the navigational significance, yet he nails the observation of what's happening on deck. Then there's also this moment of despair in Acts 27:20. Crew's spirits plummet when they are faced with a grim reality. They likely miss Sicily, and the faint hope of making it to the Tunisian coast unscathed dwindled, but Luke doesn't give us this play-by-play of why. It's like he's capturing the emotion without spelling out the cause, almost like a bystander watching the scene unfold. And check this out. When they cast anchors from the stern in Acts 27:29, it's a textbook emergency move to prevent the ship from being battered sideways by the waves. But Luke reports it without highlighting its significance, perhaps because he didn't fully grasp the unusualness of the action. Even when they're lightening the ship in Acts 27:38 to make a final desperate run for the shore, Luke doesn't dive into the reasons behind keeping grain earlier or tossing it now. He's just laying out the facts as he saw them. Now, why is this all important? Because it shows that Luke wasn't just regurgitating some sailor's tale that he got from reading Homer's Odyssey or something. No, he was a first-hand witness, a regular Joe caught up in extraordinary events, and his meticulous yet unpolished account adds a layer of authenticity that's hard to match. Hey everyone, so in my last video I kicked off this series diving into how history outside of the Bible backs up the stories in the Gospels and Acts. Now, when it comes to secular evidence in the Bible, it basically boils down to two different types. First, you've got non-Christians mentioning big events from the Gospels, like Tacitus talking about Jesus' crucifixion. Now, that's cool and all, but let's be real. Tacitus wasn't a witness or anything. He could have just picked up that info from Christians living at the time. But here's the thing. We can't really expect non-Christians to notice a lot about Jesus, since non-Christians didn't always care or pay much attention. Then there's this other kind of evidence, those subtle nods to historical settings that the Gospels and Acts casually drop in. The more low-key and obscure the mention, the more valuable. It's like they're slipping in these historical tidbits without making a big fuss about it, which is a sign that they're just telling it how it was. Now let's think about it. The gospel writers get some pretty difficult stuff right, and they didn't have access to Google or Wikipedia to help them out. They were basically flying blind without access to even modern local libraries or encyclopedias like we have today. It's a real testament to their accuracy. Alright, now with all of that in mind, let's dive into one heck of a wild scene from the book of Acts. So picture this. Paul heals a guy who couldn't walk, right? Well, it sparks a huge uproar, with folks in the crowd screaming in their own Lycaonian language that Paul and Barnabas are gods come down to earth. They even start calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes. Now, here's the kicker. Lystra wasn't your typical Greek-speaking hotspot. Nope. Since they were living more inland, they were holding on to their own native Lycaonian language. But Luke nails it with his detail, showing that he knew his stuff. And get this, there's even a historical artifact, a gloss by Stephanus of Byzantium, that backs this fact up that they were still using their own native tongues. It's these little nuggets of detail that really make you appreciate the accuracy of Luke's account. Also, isn't it kind of weird how the crowd in Lystra dubbed Barnabas as Zeus and Paul as Hermes? Well, as it turns out, every ancient community had its own set of gods they worshipped as patrons. And guess what? Archaeological finds reveal that in Lystra, specifically in Lystra, including inscriptions dedicating stuff to these two gods, showing that they were the big two patron gods of Lystra. Plus, this ancient poet Ovid, he spins his tale about Zeus and Hermes visiting the region in human form, stopping by this elderly couple's place where they were treated like royalty. The gods end up blessing the couple while bringing doom to the rest of the area, and this area was not far from Lystra. Now, you might wonder why the people from Lystra pegged Barnabas as Zeus, the top dog among gods, when Paul was the main guy in the story. Well, historical evidence suggests that when two gods popped to earth, the lesser one did most of the talking. So, since Paul was doing all the preaching, they figured Barnabas must be the big shot. Again, it's these little historical nuggets that really make Luke's narrative shine with authenticity. Now, let's fast forward 3 chapters. In Acts 17:6, there's this riot in Thessalonica against Paul, and they haul this believer named Jason and some other Christians before the politarchs, which basically means the city's authorities. Now, here's the kicker. This term politarchs was the real deal. It referred to the board of magistrates specifically in Thessalonica and not in other regions. It's not some vague and generic term that you could just stumble upon. And it's definitely not common knowledge if you've never been there yourself. These various provinces had their own unique titles depending on what region you were in. So it's easy to get mixed up with all the different names floating around. It's this kind of detail that a fictional storyteller might miss or just gloss over, but Luke nails it right on the head. Again, it's these little gems of historical accuracy that make you sit up and take notice. So in these particular narratives, Luke not only nails facts about obscure local language, but little details like titles of local officials and also their own religious customs. And again, it's all without the help of Google or Wikipedia. In Acts 22, things are getting pretty heated for Paul. He's accused of causing trouble at the temple, and he's giving his defense. The crowd goes from intently listening to him to straight up demanding his removal from the earth the moment he drops the word Gentile. It's chaos. People shouting, throwing off their cloaks, and tossing dust into the air. Then the Roman commander steps in and decides to take Paul into custody. His plan? Give Paul a good flogging and figure out why everyone's so worked up. But just as they're about to lay into him, Paul drops a bombshell. He says, "Hey, isn't it illegal to flog a Roman citizen without a trial?" Well, you can imagine the shock. The centurion rushes off to tell the commander, boss, this guy's a Roman citizen. So the commander's like, hold on. Paul, you're a Roman citizen? Paul's like, yep. But then the commander drops a bomb of his own. I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. Paul's response? Well, I didn't. I was born with it. And just like that, everything changes. The commander realizes he's made a huge mistake, being about to illegally beat a Roman citizen and all. Panic sets in, and they back off real quick. Now, that's a neat story. But what's even cooler are the historical nuggets that back up Luke's accuracy here. You see, during that era, citizenships were initially sold for a fortune, all to fill the emperor's coffers. But then, like magic, they started handing them out like a dollar menu special. It was a total political farce. You see, during Claudius's reign, the prices nosedive. Dio Cassius, a historian of ancient Rome, dishes the dirt on Emperor Claudius's wife, Messalina, and her crew, who were peddling citizenships like they were going out of style. Dio wryly remarks that you could possibly trade in a couple of chipped coffee mugs and get a Roman citizenship. You can practically hear the commander's exasperated sigh as he recalls likely shelling out a fortune for his own citizenship. But what's really interesting is how subtle and natural this whole conversation seems. And here's the kicker. This quick passage shows us that Acts wasn't likely penned in some far-off time. By the end of the 1st century, Roman citizenship was so widespread that the situation described here was a relic of the past. Most folks were already citizens, and the specialness of citizenship had faded away. The whole shady business of acquiring and selling citizenship belonged squarely in the middle of the 1st century and nowhere else. But wait, there's even more historical confirmation at play here with Paul's arrest that shows that Acts wasn't written way late. In Acts 23, 1-5, we see Paul in a bit of a tough spot. He's hauled in front of the Jewish council and ends up getting slapped across the face by orders of Ananias, the high priest. Paul does not take it lying down, though. He calls out Ananias and says, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Choice words. Well, the bystanders chime in, asking Paul if he's disrespecting the high priest. Paul's comeback might seem a little bit odd. He basically says, "Sorry guys, I didn't realize he was the high priest. You know the rules according to Moses. Don't badmouth your leaders." But here's where things get really interesting. Why didn't Paul recognize Ananias as the high priest? Well, as it turns out, there is a whole backstory to it. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Ananias, son of Nebuchadnezzar, was high priest during Quadratus's time as the head honcho in Syria. Quadratus wasn't too pleased with some of Ananias' shady dealings, so off to Rome he went, bound and all, to explain himself to Claudius Caesar. Long story short, they all make it back to Jerusalem, but Ananias doesn't get his old job back. Jonathan takes over as high priest instead, but his tenure ends tragically with an assassination in the temple. Now, here's the kicker. After Jonathan's demise, there's a bit of a high priest vacuum until Ismail, the son of Phabi, gets the nod from King Agrippa. And guess what? This all happens right around the time of the events of Acts 23. So when Ananias pulls off the high priest act, the office is actually up for grabs. He just took it upon himself to play the part at this particular time, right when Paul was arrested. So when Paul says, "I didn't realize he was the high priest," it's because he's not. Paul's being cheeky. Because Ananias was just playing high priest, he's usurping power. But Luke doesn't delve into this historical drama in his account. You have to connect the dots from sources like Josephus. Everything fits perfectly together, confirming Luke's accuracy. It seems pretty unlikely that some 2nd century writer trying to make up a fake history of the early church would just randomly stumble upon the specific incident Josephus talked about in just the right time frame and then cook up a conversation where Paul casually mocks an unofficial high priest in such an incidental way. But then at the same time, we hear from a handful of Bible scholars that the author of Acts copies Josephus, but somehow he manages to bungle all sorts of details. I don't think that they can have it both ways. Those critics who claim Acts is just fan fiction without any real historical basis just couldn't be more off the mark. In Paul's visit to Philippi, Acts 16:12 highlights 3 key details about the city. Firstly, it describes Philippi as a leading city of the district and a Roman colony, indicating its prestigious status and special privileges granted by Rome. This distinction was a source of pride for the city, and it's evidenced by historical artifacts like coins and Latin inscriptions. Secondly, Acts 16:13 mentions Paul and his companions heading to a riverside outside of the gate. While the author doesn't mention the specific river, historical context shows that it was likely the river Gangites. Despite not being a major river like the Nile, the author's casual mention of this detail adds to the authenticity of the narrative. Lastly, Acts 16:14 introduces Lydia, a seller of purple dye or fabric, originally from Thyatira, a city that was well known for its trade in purple dye. This detail reflects the historical significance of Thyatira in the purple dye industry, emphasizing the accuracy of the narrative in capturing the cultural and economic context of the time. Now, let's skip forward a little bit and talk about some of the details from the riot that went down in Ephesus in Acts 19. First off, in Acts 19:35, we see the term town clerk, and he steps in to calm the crowd. Interestingly, the Greek term grammatus used here actually referred to the magistrate in Ephesus, and this is backed up by inscriptions from the time. Now, both the rioting mob and the level-headed town clerk in Acts 19 keep dropping the name Great Artemis, the special goddess of Ephesus. As it turns out, this phrase was no random choice. It's found in inscriptions solidifying Artemis's status as a big deal in the city. And check this out. Acts 19:35 has the town clerk easing tensions by reminding everyone that Ephesus is the guardian of the temple, a title of honor that's been spotted also in inscriptions from back then. Now, let's skip forward a little bit more and dive into a little neat detail from Acts 21:1, nestled in one of those wee passages where the author is taking us through a play-by-play of this last trip to Jerusalem. So here's the scoop. They stumble upon a ship at Patara, a port in Asia Minor, bound for Phoenicia, just north of the Holy Land. Now, what's cool about this is that Patara was a bustling port known for its corn trade, making it a logical spot to hitch a ride in that direction. But here's the kicker. The name Patara in Acts is in the neuter plural form, which could possibly mean baskets. And get this, Acts nails the exact right form of the town's name, a detail backed up again by inscriptions that we have. This would not at all be common knowledge. It's this kind of accuracy that really makes you sit up and take notice. Now, these details might seem a little bit boring. And here's the part where critics usually start throwing around this idea called the Spider-Man fallacy. You know, they say stuff like, hey, well, New York City exists, but that doesn't mean that Spider-Man is real, trying to brush off any historical details in Acts as totally irrelevant. But hold on, because there is a huge flaw in that logic. Critics love to nitpick Luke for things that he supposedly gets wrong, like the census, or butting heads with Paul's letters. But think about it. If messing up historical details is a mark against Acts, then getting them spot on should be a point in its favor, shouldn't it? I mean, hey, evidence works both ways. The critics have a major double standard here. And let's be real here. It's not like the author is just nailing down some easy peasy details like the existence of a major city. Nope, they're getting hard stuff right. And they did not have Google or Wikipedia to help them out. Imagine trying to fact check without all of those handy tools. It's not like they had local libraries full of books with page numbers and chapter titles and card catalogs to help them do their reference work either. No, they were dealing with dusty scrolls that would take forever to comb through. Plus, all these accurate little nuggets point to one thing. The author probably hoofed it to these places and saw these things firsthand. I mean, pretty much everyone is on board that Paul actually existed and have traveling companions, so what's the deal? It's not even a miracle for Luke to come along with Paul, it's just good old-fashioned observation. Alright, so let's pause and really think about this for just a second. What if we entertain this skeptic's idea that Acts is just a work of fiction? Picture this. The author somehow manages to gather all these super obscure details. And again, no Google, no Wikipedia, nada. Then they decide to spin this wild tale about Paul's travels, casually throwing in these random little historical nuggets everywhere. It's like they're creating a whole new genre of fiction that didn't even exist back then. And to top it off, they try to pass off this book as real history. Sounds pretty far-fetched, right? But here's where it gets even messier for the critics. A bunch of these biblical scholars want to argue that Acts was written way later than Paul's epistles, like in the 80s or even in the early 2nd century. Yet, they claim that it contradicts those very same letters. Now, these so-called contradictions that these scholars cook up are pretty flimsy and easily explained, but still, if this author was so clever to research all of these obscure details, wouldn't they bother to make sure that their own story lined up with Paul's letters, which would have been circulating widely by that time? These skeptics are not even painting a consistent picture of the author at all.